Right. So you took a huge cut in salary. You moved to London and you became editor of Marxism Today.
Yep.
How was that?
Well,
who was on the board to begin with?
it was.
Interesting people.
No, it was one of those boards which was largely sleeping and inert.
Oh, right.
And it was. It didn't even have people who were there to keep an eye on me, because it hadn't been like that. Well, when I first started, I to be honest with you, I had no intention of doing much with it, because I regarded it to be the way in rather than the thing I wanted to do. But very rapidly, within the first couple of years, the positions that I was associated with got a series of defeats. And I'd been elected to the political committee. I was knocked off after 2 years as part of the process that went on. I really had no choice then but to take the magazine, or journal as it was called then, much more seriously. And actually I realised very rapidly when I took the position that I had made a big mistake. In my heart of hearts, I knew that the organisation was unreformable, but it was only when I got on the inside of it. It was quite a lesson, actually, that this was the case. I'm not a quitter. I never have been in anything a quitter. But I thought, well, I'm going to concentrate on Marxism Today. And the more I concentrated on Marxism Today, the more I enjoyed it. And I like acquiring new skills. I've spent my life moving around in lots of ways and so on, and acquiring and assimilating new skills. And I realised over time that I was an extremely good editor, and I'm also, what goes with my skills is I've sort of, I really enjoy strategic thinking, and so I developed a strategy from nothing. I didn't have any qualification to do what I was about to do, except that I was reasonably educated person, but I began to find where to take it, and I learned about the principles of publishing and design and the commercial aspects of it and advertising, all the things he'd never done before, and it became absolutely fascinating, but in 1982 it became, it was basically impossible to get hold of it. When I took it over, it had a circulation of about 3,000, and when and then I got it on sale in W.H. Smith, because you couldn't get it in that kind of place, and it became a big talking. It became public, became a talking point, and then it became the talking point, really, on the left. And we broke the debates on Thatcherism. That's where the term was first used in its pages, and we were so innovative, and good writers attract good writers. And
who were your star writers?
Well, the two most important writers in the history of Marxism Today, in my view, were Eric Hobsbawm and Stuart Hall. Eric, because Eric mainly about the left and about the state of the Labour Party and so on, but of course Eric's got a great range, and Stuart Hall on Thatcherism. and these were these two wrote, some extremely important articles. But many other people, some not so consistently and not usually so importantly, but many other writers contributed some very, very important pieces. And what I found, we had to invent a new kind of writing. It was no use getting academics to write as academics, because they don't know how to write. They don't exactly know what to write about and what the audience is, because they don't have a conception of audience of themselves. And the other obvious writers are journalists, but the problem with journalists is they can't sustain an idea beyond 1,000 words at the most. That's for the people who can write columns. So we had to find a sort of, let's say, a 4,000 or 5,000 word style article, between 3 and 5, 3 and 6 at the outside, which people learn how to write for, whether they were academics or whether they were journalists or whether they were something else. But predominantly they tended to come from those two groups, but not exclusively by any means. So we had to invent a new kind of writing. This was a very, very, very interesting project, and I think that the magazine was associated historically with, apart from all its innovations, its design, it was very, it was really smart operation, but it became a very smart operation. I mean, I started off on my own, one person, with a secretary working 3 days a week who was in her mid-70s, and another secretary who was 81. That's how I started off. So they weren't really, they were not going to be very useful, unfortunately. But we finished off with, sale of 25,000, and I mean, we never got any decent money, but we had, I don't know how many people, we had 10 full-time equivalents by the end. So it was, it was a big, maybe a dozen, I can't remember now. And we organised these huge events. We had, roughly every 2 years. And, it became, the three major ideas were Thatcherism, the decline of the left, and New Times post-Fordism, and so on. Those three ideas, and I'm very proud of what we achieved in that period. I think it was for me one of the two most stimulating things I've ever done in my life.
And the other was
writing the book on China.
Right. Well, we'll come to that. I mean, was this the time the New Left review was starting too, or had that been earlier?
No, that was earlier.
Yeah.
A New Left review was, New Left was going and still going, but it was much more esoteric and much more elitist, really, in the sense that it didn't, it didn't talk about. It was on a different plane, really.
I see.
Marxism Day deliberately, I thought of Marxism Day had to be conjunctural. Whereas New Left Review is not conjunctural. It had to address questions that were on people's minds now, and had to address them in a way that had a significant and important audience, and that it never spoke simply to the left. That what we wrote was of interest to, because would be of interest and engagement for anyone who was seriously interested in political debate. So very early on we developed a real audience on the right, on the radical right. I mean, the radical right used to read us because we were the best on Thatcherism. So I became, I had quite a few friends on the right. And I liked having right-wing people writing Marx's Day because, of course, you couldn't do that at the beginning because it would have been laughed out of court. But by the time the magazine had established its reputation, what happened really was, I was marginalised earlier on, in these debates and arguments and so on. I lost my position on political committee, not in the executive committee. But what happened then was the Communist Party went in decline as Marxism Today rose. So, by the end there was Marxism Today and there wasn't really a Communist Party.
But you were still a member of it.
Yeah, I stayed on because if I hadn't been doing Marx's Day, I would have left much earlier. But there you go.
When did you leave the party, or did it?
When I heard that they'd accepted Soviet money until I can't remember what year it was. It stopped. the 60s sometime. It was before, I think it was before I was active in it, but no one had, I felt I'd been, I took it very personally. I felt people had lied to me about it, because they'd always said that it wasn't true, and it was okay, it was dead. I mean, people said, why did you get so excited about that? It was obvious that had been happening, and I said, anyway, there you go. But I can't remember, after 1989.
When you were
I closed it then.
You closed it in Marxism.
I closed it at the end of 91 because I felt I was exhausted from it. I'd done it for
91.
Yeah, I did it for 77, and I did it. It was a tremendous innings to be on such low. I mean, of course, the last 4 or 5 years I became sort of, an in-demand columnist and so on. So I found other ways of supplementing my income side. It was quite a long time as a columnist at Sunday Times and the Times, and I did things at the BBC and all that. But for 10 years that was mainly basic. My income's Marks and Day. But by the end I couldn't see. I wanted to get out myself, and I couldn't see how it was going to carry on except to go in precipitous decline and become a pale shadow of what it was. And as I hate, one of the traditions of British culture I hate is the way people won't bury something when it's time to bury it. So London is littered with these organisations, and I thought, we close it. We've had a great time. It's been a great thing to do, but don't let's be spoiled. It's what it's achieved by limping on into oblivion. So I closed it, and I'm sure it was the right thing to do, because that's exactly what would have happened.
When did you become? And 2 other things you did. You co-started or started Demos.
Yeah.
What
I'm not so proud about Demos. I mean, Mark's now very proud of. There's nothing seriously I regret about Mark. I think this was a great thing to do, and it had a very good. I think it had. There's nothing that we were identified with that I regret being identified with, or. On the contrary, all the things, I'm proud of Marxism today. But Demos, it was coming out of Marx there. Now, there were 2 things I thought. 1, we should try and set up a new magazine. And 2, we should set up a think tank, because what Marx Day wasn't good at was, what should we do? That was not what our forte was. So, what should we do is the job of a think tank. So, the magazine, we got involved in discussions with the Pearson Group, FT Group, and the Guardian, and eventually we went with the Guardian, but it was on the condition that, from my point of view, that it wasn't just the Guardian, it was someone a European partner. But in the timescale that I gave them, they never found anyone. So I worked on the project for about a year, and then I abandoned it. And then the Demos, the problem with Demos is that I think the idea of Demos was, let's have a think tank which is sort of not so obviously of the left that Marxism Today was, but is a bit freer than that. Draws in, as Marxism Today had in the latter part of its life, people from other sort of politics other than the left. So it's freer. That was the idea. And anyone who's really interesting, we'll get them involved. So it was a bit free floating. I didn't want to do it myself. I was too tired from 14 years of not earning much money, and it's hard work when you've got setting something up like that from scratch without very much money. I didn't fancy doing that for Demos, so I thought someone else would be better, someone younger, etc. So I got Jeff Mulligan, who'd collaborated on Marx and Day and so on, and was a very bright chap in his 20s, late 20s, early. I think when he started about 29, 30, something like and he was director and I was. But Demos went off in a direction I didn't really feel comfortable with. I mean, it became in a way an advance guard for Blair, and that was not where I was. And I mean, I knew Blair. There was a short period when I was quite close to him, close in the sense of we still saw each other politically. Not we were exploring each other rather than being close to each other. But so Demos lost its bearings, I think, or maybe it never really had bearings, and that idea I had wasn't strong enough. So it still exists, it's still going, but it's not something that I have any, I feel queasy about it.
So what is your assessment of Blair? After the event, rear view mirror.
I think Blair was a disaster. I think that Blair, it was potentially a great moment for Labour, 1997. I mean, the huge electoral victory. I thought wrongly at the time that John Smith couldn't have produced necessarily a Labour victory. I think I was wrong about that. I think that people were so fed up with the Tories by then. I mean, Blair no doubt added the icing on the cake when it came to the size of the majority, but there still would have been a thumping majority. And my view about, I'd supported Blair as for leader of the Labour Party because I felt that I still was very concerned that the main problem was to defeat the Conservatives after all that time. And so I thought, well, Blair will give them a very hard time, which of course electorally did give them a very hard time. But I wasn't sure what he'd be like afterwards. And I wasn't very clear about that at the time of his election. But I very rapidly felt that actually this talk of a project, actually the fundamental project he didn't have an independent project. There was only one project in town, and that was the Thatcherite project of neoliberalism. And Blair was, if you like, I mean, he bought that hook, line and sinker, and so his only project really was the defeat of the hard left and the Labour Party steering this new course. Well, he didn't even really do that. Neil Kinnock did that, the Bournemouth speech and all that. So I thought that this is a rather extreme thing to say, but he was. I mean, what was this? He didn't belong to the Labour. He wasn't of that culture. Now, one of the things that attracted me originally about Blair was he wasn't of that culture because he recognised that the culture was in some ways broken. That was Marx and Day's argument. But he didn't belong to it at all. He was as close to a Conservative leader of the Labour Party we've had since 1945. And of course, Iraq, well.
Dreadful.
Awful. In so many different ways, it was a dreadful thing to do.
Do you think he's realised that it was, or do you think, I mean, he protests that it was all fine and he won't apologise? One doesn't know whether it's obstinacy or not wanting to be sued, or whether he really still believes that it was all fine.
Do you know, I'll never take seriously something like the International Criminal Court. While people like Bush and Blair go scot-free, how can anyone take it seriously? So they'll get some African leader who,
Exactly, has done some petty pilfering. Well, we agree on all this. So let's move on to the Far East. How is it you first got involved with, was it Hong Kong or Japan or China? Where did you first start getting interested in that area? I
first started when I went on a trip to Japan in 1979, but it was for a conference I was giving. My first public paper on Thatcherism, actually. This was right at the beginning. and I had a tiny bit of time to look around. I was very interested in what I saw. I was very interested in the Japanese I met at the through the conference. But really that was the end of it. And then I'd given up Marxism today at the end of 91, and 92 was the hangover from that, if you like. Still working on this new project. And then 93, going on holiday, and I'd never had any money all that time, and I never had any time.
And did you have a family by this time?
I had a partner of long standing.
You said you'd been married. You'd been married.
I was married,
and then
we the relationship was
when you were at
didn't work.
So that
that broke up in 1973. We were not suited. I mean, I was still in contact with them, so we're still friends, but not close friends. But we're still, we still keep in touch. But I didn't have any children. And then, which some people think was very strange, because I'm a very child-orientated person. And then now I had some money, and now I had time. So a friend said, well, why don't they'd just been to East Asia, so okay, that sounds good. So Hong Kong, southern China, Singapore, and then my partner wanted to spend a few days in the sun, so we finished off on an island off Malaysia. And well, this was the holiday that changed my life hugely, because no sooner I arrived in Hong Kong, which, as you know, is not the most interesting place in the world, but after you've been mainly in Europe all your life, it is interesting. And intellectually, I was absolutely fascinated by everything. And the truth is, by now I was bored writing about Britain and thinking about Britain. I mean, I've been doing it for how long? I've been doing it since I was at university, in a big way. I've been such a politicized character and intellectual, writing about these things and so on. And I was bored by it, and I wanted, and this was just something completely new. And then, right at the end of Malaysia, I met my wife to be, Harry, which was difficult. I was there with my partner, and I fell in love basically at first sight with Harry. I mean, it was just extraordinary. She was Indian Malaysian, and she was there on a bonding trip. She's a lawyer in KL, and just within a few minutes of talking to her, I couldn't, I was complete, and I was not wrong. I mean, I had met my soulmate. I had met the person who, for me, my life was the meaning of my life. I was 47 and I met her, and this was the great moment of mine. And the greatest things I ever done was to trust my emotions at that moment and of meeting her, and follow how I felt about Harry. My relationship with Harry became intricately bound up with my growing interest in East Asia.
You then went back a year later, or?
Well, no. What happened was that 3 days. I met Harry on Saturday. She left on Sunday. I mean, nothing happened, but everything happened, and we went back to London on the Tuesday, and then I couldn't get Harry out of my mind, and I was starting a television programme for the BBC afterwards, which was about the decline of politics, and politicians. It was a big subject then. And so I thought, I'll interview, I knew Chris Patton well. I thought Chris Patton might be an interesting person to interview, but he was in Hong Kong, so we flew out. I interviewed him in Hong Kong, and then I thought, hey, if I'm going to Hong Kong, that's not that far from Malaysia. Typical bloody European mentality. So I found a way of going down to Malaysia for less than 24 hours and seeing Harry, and nothing happened. And I thought, oh no, it wasn't. And then from Hong Kong, I phoned you in the morning, and I was just to say thanks very much for hosting me, and basically say goodbye. And then she said in the conversation, she said I'm missing you, and she never said anything like that. I was in Kuala, but that was then I knew that our feelings were absolutely mutual. And then I didn't see her again till Christmas in Hong Kong again, actually, it so happens. But by then, and that's when my relationship with Philippa broke down. And I told Philippa, and that was the end of our very long relationship. And Harry, the following September, came to live in Hong Kong, but before that, in London, sorry. But before that, I went to see her in Malaysia a couple of times. So that there was a very that personal story is part and parcel of what happened to me and my new interests, as well as being I finally met the person who that I'd always wanted to meet, and we had Ravi in August 1998, just before we went to live in Hong Kong.
How were you living in Hong Kong? What were you doing in Hong Kong?
Well, what happened was that at first after this in 1993, then basically in 1993 I was making television programs for the BBC and writing a column for the Sunday Times, and then I got offered a job as deputy editor of the Independent. It was when Whittam Smith and so on were going, and which I accepted. Ian Hargreaves was a friend; he was deputy editor of the FT at the time, and he became the new editor. And I accepted. Round about the time I started was when Harry came to live in England. Actually, it was a terrible. I thought to myself, I can't go wrong with this job because I'm a really good editor. I say so myself. A great editor. But I'll enjoy it, and if it doesn't work out, then I haven't lost anything. I was wrong. It was a horrible job. Horrible. I didn't like this job at all. It was like a senior management job, and there wasn't that much editing. But worst of all, the paper was in an atrocious mess, and the shareholders were in conflict with each other, and so it was a bit like a kind of a roll-on, roll-off ferry. It was lurching. It was, and of course we had to make half the staff redundant within a year. So it was a very unhappy ship. So I resigned in beginning of '96, and then I did bits of writing and so on. Like I've been in television and so on, and then someone, I think it was Neil Ferguson, said, "Why don't you write a book?" I knew Neil Ferguson quite well. And Neil said, and I said, "What should I write on?" Well, it's obvious what you're going to write on. That television series. I'd made a 2-part series in '96 on called "The End of the Western World," which was about the rise of East Asia. And he said, "Do that." And so as I thought about it, I'd never really been attracted about writing. I know this sounds odd, Alan, but I'd never been attracted by the idea of writing a book, actually. But as I thought about it, I thought, this does attract me. And of course I was, steady visitor. I found all sorts of excuses to go out to everywhere in the region, newspaper things or television thing or this, or sometimes, of course, Malaysia was to see Harry when and then she was asked by her firm. She got a job with Lovells, which is a big international law firm in London, and then it was suggested to her that she take a secondment in one of their Asian offices, because probably her future as a partner, she wasn't a partner then, but to become a partner in one of the Asian offices. So we discussed it, we agreed to do it. Just about the same time she got pregnant. And but anyway, we decided to go ahead. We went to Hong Kong in November 1998. I was, started the book. 14 months later, Harry died in hospital in Hong Kong. It was a catastrophe. I mean, I'm tough, I'm a very resilient person, but it was the only thing I knew I'd never be able to cope with. Ravi was just 16 months, and it was 5 years before I could work again after Harry died properly. I mean, I could write. It took me 2.5 years just to be able to write a newspaper article again. It was something I could do in 2 or 3 hours, a drop of a hat normally. And that was and I don't know whether you know the background, but Harry suffered a lot of racial discrimination in Hong Kong.
I've read some of your stuff on them.
And and her death was clearly a product of what happened in the hospital was clearly a product of negligence. That was patently obvious, but she was being discriminated against. That's what she told me. That's what was going on. She spoke good Cantonese. I didn't speak Cantonese, and so
you were left with a little child.
16 months. Yeah.
It was a boy. Was it?
Yeah.
And how were you managing to cope economically? Because you couldn't write. You had a little boy. You were living in Hong Kong. I mean, you couldn't be a journalist if you couldn't write. How were you surviving?
I survived. After a bit, I got bits of money together from writing. I don't know. I can't remember. 12,000 a year. I think it was 13,000 a year. We got a small pension from Harry's policy at work. And I had quite a lot of savings, because one of the advantages of learning to live on an extremely low income, as I did in Marston today, is when you have a very high income, you don't initially know how to spend it. So I saved a lot of money in that period, and we just sort of
lived simply.
Got by, very simply. Of course, I had no. I didn't go out because I had no desire to go out. I became changed me as a person. I became quite very introverted. I've never been like that. I became quite monastic, really, a hermit. And but when it finally came time when I could get back into the book, actually these were good. These are good. I never had been like this. I realised there were very, very good attributes for writing a book.
Monasticism.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was always interested in lots of things, and it's difficult to do a serious piece of writing, which requires years of concentration and so on. When you've got this thought and that thought, and you need to get on the phone and all this kind of stuff.
You change from a fox to a hedgehog. Tell me about the book. I mean, what is the theme? I've read it, but for the person who's watching this interview, what is the central argument of the book? This is the book called When China Rules the World.
Yeah.
Not If China Rules the World.
No.
When. Okay, so.
No point in beating about the bush. Well, I mean, the theme of the book is well, there are two themes really. One is the first part of the book, which is a discussion about why how the West invented and made modernity its own, historically and in a contemporary sense, and how we should understand modernity in its contemporary sense as pluralistic rather than singular. In other words, the journey of those countries since the 1950s that are in the process of modernizing are not going to become simply clones of the West. And this is a very interesting period because apart from Japan, all the previous countries have essentially been Western-style countries that had successfully modernized. And so, my argument is that actually we're moving into a period of contested modernity, where a competition will be broadly on the basis of capitalism, different political, cultural systems, and to some extent economic systems, with representing different types of modernity. That's the first part of the book, and the second part of the book is an argument to do with China, and that's how the book is, of course, known, and that's the bulk of the book, which is a discussion about the rise of China, the economic trends, and what China will be like as a modern country. And my argument is, following from the first part of the book as well, is that China will definitely not be a clone of the West, but if we want to try and understand what China will be like in the future, we have to look at its history. And so I argue that my major arguments in this context probably are, firstly, that it's not primarily a nation state but a civilization state, with, it seems to be, vast implications that flow from that. So its attitude towards lots of things, from its own sense of unity, its own sense of stability, its own notion of race, its own notion of the state as an institution, its relationship to society, are all profoundly different to the Western assumption of experience, because it's a civilization state rather than a nation state. And secondly, the fact that for thousands of years in East Asia, which was the known world to China, and China was basically dominant in that region for that sort of period, it was organized on the basis of the tributary state system. And what the characteristics of that system were, it came to an end around about 1900, and since then it's been a colonial stroke Westphalian or a Westphalian system. But the rise of China once more in the region to become, that region is becoming China-centric very rapidly again, and we're bound to see the relationships in that region bearing echoes once more of the tributary state system. Exactly how and to what extent, well, that's a complicated question, which most of which we can't answer properly at the moment. We can only speculate. And then thirdly, in some ways I think the best chapter in the book is one that hasn't been discussed very much, but it's the one entitled Middle Kingdom Mentality, which is my attempt to explore the construction of ethnicity in China, and how it is that such a vast country, over 90% of the population, think of themselves of the same race, which is extraordinary. And what the effects of that have been, but also what the implications might be in the longer run. By and large, I think the book is very sympathetic to China, but on this, it's not about whether it's pro or anti-China. It's not written in that kind of way at all. But it's an attempt to see the world through Chinese eyes as opposed to see China through Western eyes, and which is why we always get it wrong. And my concern, is this sort of Chinese sense of superiority and how that is going to affect its relations with other peoples in a world which is naturally defined by its diversity. And the fourth area, a fourth major difference is the attitude towards the state, which in a way is the starkest difference. That we have a presumption, we have a certain notion of the relationship between state and society in the West, and China doesn't conform to it. We have a view that the legitimacy of the state is based fundamentally on democracy, which in our terms does not exist in China, and yet I argue that the state enjoys more legitimacy in China than it does in the West. So what are the sources of the legitimacy of the Chinese state? So this is a very interesting question, and also the state is very sophisticated institution in China, even though it's still only a poor developing country. This is the home of statecraft. So the book is an attempt to, well, I suppose it's it is obviously ambitious. It's an attempt to explain why the world is actually tilting on its axis in the period that we're living in, and so it's historical and it's contemporary, and it's also of course looking very much into the future as well, and trying to think through what the world would be like when China is the dominant power.
Well, it's a very good book, if I may say so.
Thank you. Thank you.
I liked almost all of it.
I know the part you disagreed with.
It's a Pomerantz, really.
Yeah.
But on that last point that you made, are you optimistic? It's a very crude question, but do you think a world in which China is dominant will be as good as the world we've enjoyed under American dominance, or even better?
Well, of course we don't know. This is if we knew, we'd be either more disturbed or more reassured, but we don't know. So uncertainty itself can be a source of disturbance. I think that in one sense we should be embracing what's happening without any shadow of a doubt. And the reason I say that is because ever since the British Industrial Revolution, until more or less now, or it's beginning to change now obviously, the world has been dominated by and run by such a small sliver of humanity. So this has been a very undemocratic world, extremely undemocratic world.
You mean the Fellows of King's College, Cambridge, basically?
Well, because the West enjoyed such disproportionate economic power, and great demographic countries like China and India were so weak, they had so little voice. And actually, when the Western discourse about democracy has been about democracy within nation states, not about the international system, which during the period of Western domination has been extremely authoritarian. Now, it seems to me that the rise of China and India, 38% of the world's population, plus all Brazil and so on, means, in very rough and ready terms, the most important act of democratization the world has seen since the British Industrial Revolution. So I think that is why this is a good thing. I welcome unreservedly. Of course, it's going to produce all sorts of new problems, environmental problems, not least climate change and so on. But these people will now have a say in the world. They'll have a voice in the world. Before they didn't. Who listened to China 30 years ago? No one listened to China 30 years ago except people a bit round in that region. So this is a good thing. What will China be like in terms of its behaviour, more, China specifically? Let's say China is the dominant country in the world, which I think it will become. How will it behave? Well, I think this is very, very difficult to answer. I mean, I'm not of the school. I mean, a lot of the Western reaction about the rise of China is, I think, based on arrogance and ignorance. The arrogance is it's got to be worse because it's not us anymore, I suppose, to put it simply. And ignorance, because people, see, a lot of people, a lot of intellectuals included here, think that the rise of, that these other cultures have no wisdoms. That we more or less have a monopoly of wisdom. I think all cultures, whatever the level of development, have wisdom. They've had to cope with their own circumstances, geographical, climatic, political, whatever they are. In particular, this is a great civilization, Chinese history, Chinese culture. This is not nothing. This is, we have so much to learn from this. So the idea it's just going to be a sort of brutal negative, it's not going to be like that. It is absolutely not going to be like that. And it's very interesting that the rise of China has not been characterized as the rise of the Soviet Union was with a desire to engage in a military standoff. I mean, actually the Chinese have put very few resources hitherto into their military expenditure. I mean, even today, they're just completing their first aircraft carrier. I mean, even Italy's got an aircraft carrier. India's got an aircraft carrier. Britain's got 3 aircraft carriers. And China's already the second largest country in the world economically. So I think we need to, adopt a much more worldly attitude. I love this thing in Cohen's book, rediscovering Chinese history. He quotes someone, but he makes a point of his own, which is, the West thinks of itself as the most cosmopolitan culture in the world, but in many ways it's the most parochial, because whereas other cultures have been obliged to turn themselves inside out in their engagement with the West, principally through colonialism, but not only through colonialism, the West has never ever been obliged to rethink itself, because it's never been forced to by its relationship with the other that it thinks with which it's enjoyed a dominant relationship. And I think this is a very, very important insight into what our mental problem is about addressing these kinds of questions. So, to be honest with you, for me personally, it is hugely the most interesting thing I've ever had to think about.
Just one or two more questions on that. One is, what struck me, particularly on my last visit, was a kind of inattention within China, which is that it lives by 2 standards. America proclaims democracy, equality and so on, and falls very short of that, but it knows what its ideals are. In China you have the 4 principal foundations of Marxism have collapsed: equality, no class system, no state, no ideology, religious ideology, no private property, and so on. All those have come back. In other words, everyone admits it's a capitalist economy and in many ways a capitalist society now. And yet its ideology formally is still supposedly communist. And this leads, I would have thought, to a lot of dissonance, because you can't. What are you aiming at in the future? What is the goal of China in 30 years' time? Because it's given up the ideals of Mao and so on, and yet it hasn't found new ones. It doesn't want to be the West, but it doesn't want to be the main rival to the West, which was Marxism. And this, I think, is the danger, unless it finds a set of... I mean, you may answer that it's going back to its Confucian past or something like this, but
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know what you think about how it can achieve some kind of alternative model of how it should be when it's given up the two main ones available to it.
Well, how you present it is clearly true. I think that that partly we need to interrogate the relationship between this communist period and the Confucian period, and thereby escape from a very strong way of thinking, which is clearly very influenced by the Cold War, which is the two are completely estranged and there aren't powerful lines of continuity between them. And I think there are. And I try to argue this, that this is one, I mean, maybe I go too far in the opposite direction of the book, but I was trying to argue against what seems to me to be a mistaken position, which is extremely influential, which is this period is an aberration compared to what went before, and I don't think that's true at all. I think that the Maoist tradition clearly belongs as very much part of the Chinese tradition, and I think the Confucian, in many ways, Confucianism is much more influential than any of the communist tradition in the long run in shaping Chinese attitudes, be it the family or be it the state or be it the nature of education and so on. And so those things are still very powerful, I think, in China, and they will be enjoined, I think, as China gets stronger by, in some senses, a return to the past. I think that the difficulty China's had since '78 and the Deng Xiaoping dictum of sort of lie low and sotto voce is that they've deliberately not. The other side of this, which we don't talk about, is they've not allowed themselves to think about these questions because, well, it was a luxury under the circumstances, But when they do think about what China is, then I think there'll be a very effervescent debate about the relationship between what they were and, at some point the communist period, because I think a lot of the communist period has been in many ways, with all the bad things, very bad things, some of the bad. I mean, Mao was a complicated character, and now this period, there's a lot that there is an opening discussion, it seems to me, taking place in China, and it will be that discussion which begins to make sense, possibly, of these things and what China is, what is it, where does it come from, where is it going, what does it offer the world. These are the things they're going to have to sort of sort out, I think, in their minds. They haven't sorted out where Mao is, I think, in their pantheon, because Mao is still hugely more popular than Deng Xiaoping. This is a very interesting thing, I think. Now, I think the main reason for Mao's popularity is because he reunified the country, and any emperor that reunifies the country will always be a semi-deity in China. And he also reconstructed the state, and the state is the most important institution apart from the family in China. And this was, he created, if you like, none of what's happened under Deng Xiaoping would have been possible without that achievement under Mao. That the Deng achievements lie within the context of that possibility. Mao could not have done what Deng did because he was also crazy in some ways.
Well, I think that's answered actually my questions. Just coming to the end of the tape, but is there anything that you'd like me to ask you about that I haven't asked about? Your son, for instance, your little boy. How old is he now?
Ravi's just 13.
13. Oh,
Yeah,
gosh.
and so he's now already that much taller than me.
Wow.
And well, he kept me going. You know, I mean, I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't had Ravi. And so we're very, very close. And you know, I've been a very, very dedicated father, but to my great enjoyment and pleasure. So, and he's, you know, he's his own character. He looks just like his mum. He doesn't look like his dad.
Well, that's a good start.
Yeah, it is a very good start.
No,
Not
negative.
No, you were right.
But I'm sure his mum is beautiful and so on.
She was.
Anyway, on that cheerful note, I think we'll stop, and thank you very much indeed, Mark.
Thank you for your